Hello and welcome to the third Landscape Builder tutorial. In this one we're going to be doing a bit of topography work and I'm going to be focusing on the value-based Perlin noise. So if you haven't looked at the first tutorial on the interface, I recommend you look at that now before watching this because it shows a bit more of the interface and this will make a lot more sense if you do that first. So I'm just going to quickly create a landscape as usual, so 4 kilometers by 4 kilometers, all the defaults. I'm going to put the base map distance to 5,000 in the terrain settings to make the textures look a bit better. And I'm just going to hit generate landscape. So that creates that. Okay, so in the landscape I'm just going to set up some scene lighting as usual. Yep. And now we're going to go into topography. So I'm just going to leave it at the default preset. Set it to default. But I'm going to set the fake erosion type to none just to start with to make it a bit more easy to understand what I'm showing. So we'll generate the height map. Generates this landscape, basically the default landscape but with a bit of subtle changes because there's no erosion. And I'm just going to add some texturing just so that we can see what's happening. So I've already added the textures in from last time. So I've got some grass hill albedo at inclination 0 to 35 degrees, and I've got cliff albedo specular with a tiling of 100 by 100 and inclination 30 to 90. So basically the cliff texture will show up where it's steep, the grass texture will show up where it's not so steep. So I'll texture it. Okay. So what I'm basically going to be showing in this tutorial is just what all this stuff does up here. I mean, it can look a little complicated because with the advanced settings especially, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's quite a few sliders and tick boxes and stuff, and it's hard to know if you're not really familiar with noise functions what all this stuff does. It's back to 0. Just, it's got a few default, setting it back to default settings. Okay. So the first thing that we want to have a look at is noise tile size. So I'll turn off fog so we can see things a little better. The noise tile size basically controls the scaling of the noise on the X and Z axes. So basically, if you want your topography features to be wider or more spread out, you increase the value. And if you want your features to be narrower, you decrease the value. So that's the noise tile size up here. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the noise tile size to 2,500. So this is my 0 point where I've got my mouse here. And if you look at it when I click generate, you'll notice that this point hasn't changed in height. Now that's pretty important. What's happening is although this looks like it's all changed, it's basically just been compressed. Like it's been made narrower. It looks like it's actually gotten taller, but it hasn't. It's just more of what was over here is now gone over here. And what's over here came over here. So if I texture it, you should be able to see a bit of what's happening there as well. So we've got some steeper areas because of how it's been compressed more. So now what we have also are noise offsets. So basically the offset of the noise on the X and Z axes. So if you want everything to move this way, you set the X offset a bit more. If you want everything to move this way, you set the Z axis offset a bit more. So if I set the noise offset to 100, you'll see what I mean. So everything has been shifted that way a bit. The other thing that you use the noise offset for is if you like what your terrain is a bit, but you don't really want the features all in those places. You want something a little different. So if you just set this to something completely random like 5,000 and 6,000, and you generate the height map, you get basically a completely different terrain, but it has the same characteristics as what you had before. So next, what we come to are the noise octaves up here. So basically what you can think of noise octaves as, you can think of the noise octaves as the detail of the noise. Basically how much detail it has. So if we look at this terrain, it's rather bumpy. There's a lot of spiky stuff going on, and that's probably not optimal. So if we change the noise octaves from 11 down to 7, and we click generate, and then texture it to show better where the steep bits are, you'll notice that a lot of the spikiness has actually gone out of it. We've got a lot less detail in the noise, which sometimes you want and sometimes you don't want. In this case, we don't really want it because otherwise it's a bit too bumpy and turbulent. So if you decrease the number of octaves in the noise, you get less detail. If you increase the number of octaves in noise, you get more detail. So next on the list are ridged noise and inverse noise. So basically, ridge noise is good for when you're making a mountain range or something similar, something to do with something mountainous. What ridge noise does is it will give you these kind of ridges. So if I click generate, and I put the noise tile size back to 5,000 as it is as default, you'll notice we're kind of getting these kind of ridges. If I turn the fog off, it might be a bit more apparent. Like this ridge here, and we're getting a bit of a ridge here as well. So that's what ridge noise does. It will generate those ridges for you for a mountain landscape. If we click inverse, inverse flips the landscape upside down basically. So everything that was high now becomes low, and everything that's low now becomes high. If you use inverse while you've got ridge noise ticks, instead of getting these kind of mountain ridges, you get more kind of a hilly landscape. So instead of getting these ridges that you usually get from mountains, we're getting more of these kind of bumpy ridges, like these inverse ridges, which is better for hilly landscapes. So if I untick that, we can go back to the old one, texture it so we can see a bit more what it looks like. We get more of a mountainous landscape. So the next thing to look at is erosion. There are 4 types of erosion. There's the default of none, which does nothing. Then you've got stream erosion. Stream erosion basically gives the effect of erosion that you usually tend to get from streams. So if we do it, the things to notice here are these steeper ridges and the effect of terracing. So usually you end up with a lot more steep areas, but also a lot more flat areas, as if some sort of stream's gone by and washed off sediment and deposited it somewhere else. Rain erosion, on the other hand, gives quite a different effect. So if we go to rain erosion and generate it, and texture it, you'll notice that most of the stream erosion stuff's gone away. Instead, what we're getting are these little rivulets here. Little areas that look like they've been affected by rain runoff. The last type of erosion we have is combined erosion, and combined erosion is basically just a combination of rain erosion and stream erosion. So we'll just go back to no erosion, and then we come to the advanced settings. So there are quite a few advanced settings, and usually if you're just working from a preset, you've just chosen a preset and you're just modifying a bit, you will just be leaving the advanced settings alone. But often it's a good idea to have an understanding of what the advanced settings do. So what the power does is it's the power that all your terrain, all your landscape is raised to. So if you made it 2, then it would be just all your landscape with each height squared. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it to 1.5. What this will do, because I'm increasing the power, steep areas will become steeper and flat areas will become flatter. If I went the opposite way, if I made it smaller, then the steep areas would become flatter and the flat areas would become steeper. So I'll just generate this. And texture it, and already we're noticing that a lot of these mountain areas have become a lot steeper. We've got some very tall mountains here, but also on the other hand we've got some much flatter areas like this little canyon area here. So after this we've got latkinarity. Now latkinarity is something you probably haven't heard of. It's a noise function term. But the basic rundown of it is latkinarity, if you increase it, it means that you're going to get more bumpy terrain. And if you decrease it, you're going to get smoother terrain. Now, if we have a look here, we can see that, for instance, these ridges, they're looking rather bumpy and not really much like defined ridges. They've just got spiky bits, which can kind of look a bit strange. So what we can do to fix this is we can decrease the noise latkinarity down to 1.95. So I'm only decreasing it a little bit because the latkinarity value is pretty sensitive and you don't want to change it too much. So if I just click generate, and although the landscape's changed a little bit, which is something that would usually happen when you change the latkinarity value, this ridge, for instance, is becoming a lot more defined and obvious that it's a ridge, not just a bunch of spiky bits. Also, this area down here has become a lot smoother, as with this cliff bit here as well. So next we've got gain. Gain is a bit similar to latkinarity in that you're using it to try and make stuff less bumpy. But what it really does is it's how influential, I guess. You can change it to make smaller features, smaller details less or more prominent. So one thing we notice here is that although this ridge is pretty prominent, we've got some very bumpy areas here still, which is because the small details are very prominent, very defined. So what we can do is, if we drop the noise gain, smaller features will be faded out more. If we increase the noise gain, smaller features will be bigger. So if I drop the noise gain down to 0.48, again, making sure not to change it too much as it's a sensitive value, then I click generate. Again, everything's been changed a little, but we notice that this has been smoothed out a little. So I'll just texture that. You can see that the graph, there's a bit more grass up here because it's a bit flatter. And now we can move on to the next thing. So now we've got warp amount and its companion thing, warp octaves. So basically what you're aiming to do with warp is to add more variety to your terrain. So if I just drop down the warp amount back down to 0, so no warping, you'll notice that we get a very different terrain to what we had before. So warping, what it will do is it will just warp your terrain. So this is a very, very basic terrain. It's just mountains here, and it's kind of a bowl bit here, and just the mountains are just mountains, and they don't really have any stretching or warping applied to them. So they can sometimes look a little unnatural and generated. So when you put the warping, when you increase the warping, then you get a little less computer generated feel to it and more of a natural feel. You also tend to get these kind of long curved artifacts, so turning warp amount up too much can be a bit of a problem. So if I just turn up the warp amount to 2, the maximum, you can see the effect of full warping. So you can see here that we're getting a lot of these curved bits, long curved areas, but it does generate a lot of extra variety, so we get this very interesting feature down there, but also some plains areas, so the whole terrain doesn't look the same. So I'll just put the warp amount back down to 1 as the default. The other thing you can do is if you want more detailed warping, like warping of small features, you can increase the warp octaves, but it's a bit out of the scope of this tutorial to talk about that. The penultimate thing we've got here, height scale. So the height scale is the scaling of the landscape in the y-axis. So if you decrease it to something like 0.5, everything will be scaled down by a factor of 2 or a half, either way. So usually if you decrease the height scale, you're going to get everything less steep. If you increase it, you're going to get everything more steep. So if we just drop this down to 0.5 and generate it, we texture that as well, you notice that everything's been scaled down a lot, and that, as evidenced by the fact that most of it's a grass texture, it's not very steep at all. So this would be good for a game where you don't want much steepness in the terrain. You just want a kind of flat area, but you still want some mountain range bits and stuff. So you can put the height scale back to 1. And texture it. And we come to our last part of the settings, the curve modifier. So the curve modifier is probably the most complicated bit to get your head around. Basically, the curve modifier allows you to specify a curve which will be used to modify the overall characteristics of the topography. So I can bring up this little curve window, which is default Unity curve window. If you've ever used animations, you might have seen it in the animation curve window. The default curve is just this straight line from 0, 0 to 1, 1. So this has no effect on the topography. What the curve is showing is basically this. The input height from the noise function is on the x-axis. So 0 is the lowest height the topography could possibly be, and 1 is the highest height the topography could be. And on the y-axis, we've got the output height of the topography, so what the topography will actually show. So 0 is the lowest height it could be, and 1 is the highest height it could be. So as a demonstration of what it kind of does, I'll pick the third preset here. It's kind of a curve starting low and getting steeper as well. And I'll click generate here. So what's basically happened here is that all these flat areas have been flattened. but all the high up areas have been steepened. So you can see this in the curve, like these are the low areas. So these low areas on the topography have been made flatter, but the higher up areas have been made steeper. So basically with the curve modifier, you can do pretty much anything to modify the characteristics of the terrain, as long as you're not modifying octaves of noise or ridge noise or anything like that. But this will give the characteristics of what your terrain looks like at each height. So for instance, we could add terracing to our terrain by adding a few more keys and moving them around a bit. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding steeper and flatter areas to my terrain. So this will create terraces. So if I just click generate, we notice that this flat area is relatively flat, and then we've got a very steep ridge here, but then it comes in to another flatter area, so the terrace, and then these points are part of this last steep bit up here. So that finishes the third landscape builder tutorial on topography. Thank you for watching.